I've been talking about cerebral spinal fluid created in the choroid plexus of the ventricles, providing safe blood filtrate for the brain. But the brain is also heavily vascularized with blood vessels and capillaries coursing through the brain tissue.
Your brain is about 2% of your body weight and consumes about 20% of your body's energy. That's the glucose and the oxygen, right? Your brain is highly intensive energy, right? It's constantly working. Your brain and your heart are the two most active, constantly active things in your body. Right? And the only thing that it takes in, it doesn't store glycogen, doesn't break down lipids. The only thing it uses is glucose, right? So glucose is, you really need glucose for your brain. Otherwise, your brain starts shutting down, right? So glucose homeostasis is a really super important point, making sure your blood glucose is proper so your brain works. If your brain doesn't work, you shut down, right? For the most part, right? All aerobic respiration too, right? So highly dependent on glucose and highly dependent on oxygen because it's all aerobic, right? To make ATP for everything it does right here. High demand for oxygenated and glucose rich blood in there, right? And oxygen gets in pretty easy through these, not these are bigger blood vessels, but the smallest capillaries are going to able to get through. Glucose and other things are going to have to work a little harder.
But also remember, neural tissue requires a highly controlled chemical environment in which to carry out its normal functions. So it'll be very restrictive in what passes into it from the rest of the body. Besides any kind of toxins or pathogens, the circulating blood may contain neurotransmitters or small molecules that act like neurotransmitters, which need to be tightly controlled. Importantly, the brain has its own little private immune system and does not normally interact with the body's immune system. An immune response and inflammation can wreak havoc if immune cells find themselves suddenly in the brain tissue. Remember, meningitis was inflammation of the meninges, which can cause pressure and press against brain tissue. In encephalitis, the brain tissue itself is inflamed, and that is a much more dangerous situation. The biggest problem occurs when immune cells, not normally allowed in the brain, begin an immune response against your own brain because basically it's not familiar with what it is seeing and it begins attacking it.
So your basic function of your blood-brain barrier is to get all this oxygen and nutrients in, but also keep other things out, right? Maintain a very stable environment for neurons who are very sensitive. They're what do you call them? Prima donnas, right? They need a very particular environment, right? They can't have like neurotransmitters and toxins floating around, right? If there was excess neurotransmitters, they just start, causing postsynaptic potentials because they are circulating your blood. A lot of things can act as neurotransmitters in your blood. You got to keep them out. Your brain doesn't have its own immune system, really. It's got microglia, but it has its own immune system, but the rest of the immune system isn't allowed in your brain. So typically, you want to keep them out of there. Any kind of toxins and pathogens and anything like that, right? So your brain is very tightly controlled what comes in. A couple locations in your body where you need to have a little freer access, right? So first off, and here's where, kind of differs from what I talk about, but your blood supply to your brain is coming in through your internal carotid arteries, right, that go in through your carotid canal, and you're one of those holes in your brain. It's going in through here to supply most of the front half of your brain. And then you have those vertebral arteries going up through those transverse foramen in your cervical vertebrae, going up through your foramen magnum, supplying the posterior parts of your brain. Right. So major blood supply, two of them, DOA one, in case you get locked out over here, there's connections in between them that can always supply blood to your brain. These are internal carotid arteries, your vertebral arteries. You'll learn about them again in Bio 145, I'm guessing. But that's the supply to your head. So when we talk about blood supply, let's try to incorporate this into kind of our other systems that we looked at, right? We talked about bone tissue way back. We talked about the heavy vascularization of blood with those central canals, and then the capillaries feeding, because blood was bone was very, also very active cells right there. So you had all this blood going in. You had a lot of blood vessels going into your skeletal muscle cells that we saw, right, through the endomysium, all those little capillaries. And what was happening? Oxygen, glucose coming right out of these and taken up by the cells right around there. That's what your blood system's all about, right? Your skin had that papillary plexus up here, blood supply coming in here. And then you have this nutrient and gas exchange up over here to supply those epithelial cells, right? Big picture is that blood is going to be coming in through your arteries and your arterioles. They're going to go through a particular capillary bed. And this is where everything is exchanged. Up to this point, it's just moving along. And at this point, your filtrate is going to be flowing out. And it's going to, and the waste is going to be coming into those vessels, right? And be carried away. So this will be true for any system in your body, right? So blood's coming in through the arterial end, being pushed out. This is something you'll learn, so it's useful to kind of maybe just go over this briefly now. You're going to have to understand this later. You're going to have a push in the arterial end. It's going to force the filtrate out, which means normally this means like glucose, oxygen, other stuff, right? Coming out with the dissolved water right here. And that's going to be feeding the cells, right? And they're going to use that to work hard and create CO2 and waste, right? Which is going to be taken up at the other end because all this water has flowed out. You build up osmotic pressure, and by osmosis, things are going to flow in the venous end. Right? So that's how you get the CO2 and the waste in the other end, and then it's going to be transported to the rest of your body. This free exchange with the interstitial fluid is the whole purpose of these capillary beds. Interstitial fluid, very happy to see all this stuff right here. He's the Amazon delivery guy, and he's bringing exactly what he needs, and he's taking away the stuff he doesn't want. Thank you very much. Right, very happy to see him, and very permeable in this case. It's going to let out all this stuff right here. Very free exchange, and some places much more freer than others. Right? But for our person, this is fairly tight relative to, say, your kidneys and liver and stuff. But that's what's happening. Okay, this has nothing to do with anything we're talking about, except that we're going to see a difference. When we get to the brain, things are going to be a little bit different, right? You still have capillaries and stuff going through the brain tissue, but you'll notice it's covered up right here. It's going to be highly protected. These astrocytes, when you think of astrocytes, it's one of the glial cells, right? Your ependymal cells were lining the ventricles. Your astrocytes are involved in this blood-brain barrier, which is going to mean that there's not a quite free exchange between these capillaries and the system. This one here is going to kind of control what comes out of there. That's one way we control what comes out of your capillaries. Right? So there's going to be these astrocytes, right, that are lining all these kind of like this, right? So that your capillaries going through here are not going to get free passage, right? Not everything's just going to pour out here. So this blood-brain barrier consists of basically two things, right? The astrocytes that I just talked about, and then these tight junctions. The tight junctions in between the cells, right? They're going to be strong connections in between the simple squamous epithelial cells that line your blood vessels, the endothelial cells. So again, in the normal situation, throughout the rest of your bodies, stuff is coming out here. It's coming out this way. And again, everybody's happy to see it. They're fine with all this stuff coming out. And, you know, here's the Amazon delivery guy. He delivers everything, and all of a sudden he goes to the White House. And there's all these Secret Service guys around him. He's just not going to let everything out. They got to check everything that's coming out of here pretty much. Not everything. Some things going to get through very easy, right? Lipid soluble things are still going to diffuse very easy through the cell membrane over here. So oxygen leaving, carbon dioxide can go back out. That's free exchange right here. And maybe some other lipid soluble things can get through this, but all the rest of it is going to be tightly controlled, right, through passage of the cells into the brain right here. Right, so these tight junctions along with these astroglial foot processes are what is creating this blood-brain barrier, right? Tight junctions, astrocytes. The other thing that's controlling it, all capillaries have this to some extent, but we have this selective transport. Remember, we had a basal side, an apical side facing the environment and a basal side. And so the stuff we want, right, like glucose channels and stuff like that, they'll be all over. And glucose can come in and come into the cell, right? Or things could go through transcytosis. Things could like bind to receptor. Remember that exocytosis went in one end and left the other. Endocytosis on one end, exocytosis on the other end, right? Some things get right through passive diffusion, oxygen stuff. Things don't get through the tight junctions, right? So anything we want, we have special channels for, right? Amino acids, glucose, all that stuff to bring it in. Oxygen, carbon dioxide diffuse freely through it. The other thing that gets through very easy is lipid soluble molecules. Remember the lipid bilayer? Those can get through here. That could still get through. So alcohol, ethanol, is a lipid soluble molecule. Nicotine is also a very small molecule that can get right through the lipid bilayer and get through. Caffeine. If these guys didn't do that, we wouldn't be using them, right? Because they wouldn't work very well because they couldn't get into your brain to have the effect that they do. So, this is a big issue for pharmaceutical companies who want to develop drugs for the brain, right? You got to be able to break this barrier right here. And they do that by hitching it to stuff that's normally brought in through carrier mediated transport or bound to some of these receptors. That's another way that tricky viruses and stuff can like bind to these receptors and get into the body. So we are very selectively letting stuff into the brain through these mechanisms, right? One other thing we mentioned here, it's interesting, like antihistamines, the old type, would get into your brain very easy because they were lipid soluble. And then the other types that aren't non-drowsy types are ones that are water soluble that aren't able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and they don't have that effect on your central nervous system. So that's just a kind of demonstration of the difference of that. All right, so that's their blood-brain barrier. I also want to mention that you do need certain areas of your brain that need access to what's going on in your body. So they need a freer exchange between the brain tissue and the blood. So there's a couple areas where your blood-brain barrier is incomplete. The whole function of the neurons, in this case, of that particular area, are going to depend on having full access to the blood, right? So your hypothalamus, we already talked about those neurosecretory hormones that are made in the hypothalamus and have to keep passed on to your anterior pituitary. They need access to the blood vessels. They can't be all guarded up to put the hormones in them, and then the hormones are sent down there. And then another one is there's certain regions in your brainstem, right, as well as your hypothalamus, that are going to pick up contents of the blood. In this example here, in your medulla, there is a little center that picks up some kind of anything bad that you might have ate, anything toxic. And when it senses that, it initiates a vomiting reflex to get rid of that stuff. So it needs access to your blood, not just your brain tissue circulation, right? So those kind of things that anywhere where you need full access to the blood, you might have a incomplete blood-brain barrier, right? So that is basically the summary of our brain protection part.